Welcome to Recogs, the Inventory Success podcast where we discuss how the top operators source, manufacture, finance, and sell their inventory and create successful businesses. I'm your host, Mike Gelb. I'm the community manager here at Manufactured. Manufactured is the inventory success platform for consumer and B2B companies. What do we mean when we say inventory success? Well, we help SMBs manufacture, finance, and distribute their products across 20 categories. If you're looking for help to reduce your COGS, or you're looking for inventory financing or selling on new channels, we're happy to see if we can help at manufacturer.com. Now, this is a free podcast, but that doesn't mean we don't have a favor to ask you. If you're enjoying this, if you can please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you're listening to your podcast, to this episode, that'd be amazing. And if you can leave us a review on the Apple Podcast app, that would be terrific as well, and that would really mean a lot. We also not only produce content devoted towards SMBs, but we also produce events. If you want to sign up for an event newsletter, check out manufactured.com/events. Also located in the show notes, that link. Our guest today is Joseph Ertman, who is the president of Real Vision Foods. Real Vision Foods is a contract manufacturer of plant-based supportive food products. They are fully integrated sourcing, product development, technology application, and producer for brands. We discuss in this conversation, this is quite a unique one because I think this is the first contract manufacturer that we've had on the show. So we discuss what that relationship is like between brand and manufacturer. When does it make sense for a brand to actually use a contract manufacturer? How that relationship unfolds, product complexities, creating products that can scale, that make sense for a margin profile, and what happens when a brand that you work with really takes off, really does extremely well. It's a bit more complex than you would think. Without further ado, here's Joseph. Joe, thanks so much for hopping on. How are you?
Great, thanks, Mike. Look forward to it.
So you are our first manufacturer that has come on and on the show, and I think that's tremendous because we really haven't shared that perspective yet. We've really talked about the brand perspective and the entrepreneur perspective, which is unbelievably important. And we've had really, really great discussions, but really excited to hear from your perspective as a manufacturer and servicing and building products for all these incredible brands in the food space. So really excited to chat with you. Starting off from the very beginning, when does it make sense when a company is still early on? When does it make sense for a company to actually bring on a co-manufacturer?
Well, we see, there's a lot of ways to answer that question for brands as they come out of the starting blocks. Many people are, drumming up recipes and cooking for family and friends. Some people have taken it further to, go into a commissary kitchen or lease space or time at a restaurant. I think one of the key steps in the validation of taking the much more significant step toward a co-man is, what type of market experience does the brand have? What are they actually experiencing in the marketplace? Is it sales, or is it just interest, or is it giveaways? How is the brand and the product proposition actually being validated? Because we're trying to assess the likelihood of success for the brand. And in some cases, brands will come to us with very limited market experience, with a lot of referrals, a lot of accolades, but not necessarily a commercial history of a transaction where people are paying for the product. And so one of the things that's critical for me is, how do you know your product is as unique and delicious and wanted as you believe it is? And so I'm looking for market validation that says there's a strong interest, there's growing interest, there's points of distribution expansion, and is the volume as such something that can rationalize the type of investment that would come with coming into a co-man structure as opposed to a commissary kitchen or leasing out time and space at a restaurant?
How can you talk a little bit about that, like proof points for a brand where it actually then makes sense to actually bring on a co-manufacturer? Because the proof point that I kind of think about are almost when it's almost like too late. Meaning like you already maybe have like a few POs. Maybe that's the first proof point though that you like to see. I'm just kind of curious in terms of like what has to be inspiring to you or interesting to you in order to actually bring on um a brand.
So there's a lot of different co-mans, a lot of different sizes. I mean, some people are co-manufacturing in 5,000 square foot up to 100,000 square foot. So the minimums, the MOQs, and the levels of production, the throughput that you're referring to is really going to vary by co-man. Um, and smaller organizations and smaller footprints can probably accept and enroll smaller players um, that would be able to cover the necessary cost structure that exists in a smaller plant situation. The other factor that comes into play is the complexity of the product itself. What's involved, how many operations, how many processes, what type of packaging is involved. So the one needs to look at the complexity of the execution and judge whether that's going to fit within the capabilities of your organization. But that capability framework is going to vary by the size of the co-man. And if it's a one-man show or one-woman show and they've got a couple production workers doing, a baked cookie that's simply flow wrapped, that's very different than doing a fermentation and emulsification and cooking and cooling and packaging in a cup and sealing. All of those come into play to judge whether we want to invest, because that's what's going to happen, invest time, attention, and technical know-how into a more significant commercialization process.
How well okay, so how do you think about complexity for a brand? I mean, when a brand's early and um when do you ever get the sense that they might be uh making the product maybe too complex for what it is, or and maybe that doesn't quite work out as you see, like, okay, we actually can't scale this, or it's going to be way too expensive. You probably could scale it, but it's going to be way too expensive to actually scale it, where it actually your margin structure just is not going to work for it. How do you does that happen, or like, and if so, how do you approach it?
Does it happen? Yes, unequivocally, it happens at two levels. One is formulation complexity. So, um, some products have 20 to 25 ingredients. And so you're sourcing unique starches and gums and esoteric type flavors. So just the sheer supply chain weight of sourcing 25 ingredients to make a particular SKU is difficult, and it's a risk because you're talking about weighing accuracy. You got to make sure you don't delete one item. Obviously, you've got to source it, and you've got to source it on time. So you've got formulaic complexity. The other layer is really the process. And it's not unusual where a particular brand will come in and say, okay, this is how we do it. This is the blender we use, and then we take a spatula and then we wipe the sides, and then we come back and we use a different blender over here, and then we put it in ice water and we cool it for 10 seconds, and then we pump it out, and then they go through this sequence of events that they've used that may not have really been battle tested at all outside of a small kitchen. And every one of those steps is not only cost, but it's a likelihood, it's a risk of failure. So you've got complexity in formulation with a lot of ingredients. So you have supply chain, and you've got mix accuracy risks. And then you get into the process dimensions where we've got to follow what was necessarily used to develop a certain attribute that they felt was very compelling, but is not repeatable at any scale, um, outside of adding a lot of labor, which in the end is going to be problematic. So, formulation, ingredient complexity in terms of numbers, and then the nature of the process and how much of that can be simplified, reduced, combined. And we would make an assessment uh, whether we can actually execute the way it was produced previously and whether we feel there's opportunity or, excuse me, room for simplification, which is something that we're always looking to do.
What tends to be the response when it comes to reducing complexity and going to simplicity? Because
Very, very good question. Uh, the, the general reaction is reluctance because the parties have undoubtedly spent a lot of time and a lot of sweat equity getting to the point where they're ready to have this conversation. They may have gotten and received market feedback on the product being very good. They love the texture, the flavor's great. So they are very invested in what they've done to date. And trying to unwind that is uh, can be very difficult. It depends on the flexibility of the brand owner and the understanding and comprehension that scaling is going to require a different approach. But that varies on the continuum of whether people are embracing that or supporting that, as opposed to truly being reluctant and just telling me to replicate what they've done on a smaller scale.
I know this is product really I'm sure it's dependent on the product, but in terms of minimum order quantities, what tends to be your order quantities that you deal with?
So in my world, we deal a lot with cooking emulsification. So we're dealing with cheeses, spreads, dips. My kettle size will typically dictate the batch size of the particular item, which will range between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds a batch. And in a day, in an 8-hour day, we would expect to process minimally 4 batches and possibly 5 to 6 batches in a shift to achieve the kind of economics that everybody's expecting. So it is specific. Um, that's sauces. We've also done bars and baked items where the batch size in terms of mixing size is much, much smaller. But in both cases, you're always dealing with the weight of the fixed cost of the facility, which is the rent, the utilities, the insurance, the taxes, the capital structure. So at the end of the day, cost is going to be driven by how many pounds I can put through in that shift or day.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. How it's very, very dependent in terms of also like I'd imagine where you are utilized currently too, right? Well, I mean, speaking of utilization, like how does that kind of dictate um, what? Obviously, taking on new clients, if you're pretty much fully utilized, I'd imagine you're probably not going to be taking on many new clients soon. But if you can walk us through a little bit where utilization levels, how that kind of could relate to risk in terms of that you're actually able to uh when it comes to like the types of brands that you might bring on.
Well, I mean, the cold reality is that, during COVID and even after COVID and through the whole entire plant-based realignment that I would characterize over the last year and a half, which continues, um, utilization levels have dropped, um, and hence where we thought we were going to be fully in production, we are not. So we are faced with a known fixed cost overhead and obligations. We have employees, we have the capital structure that I mentioned earlier. You're trying to retain the intellectual property of your team members, your QA, maintenance, obviously production. So I would say there's going to be this judgment of how far on the risk profile do I go for the benefit of trying to improve my utilization and cover my cost. And the fact is that I probably will take more risk at lower utilization than I would traditionally if I'm at 90% or above. Um, you know, At one point, I had a $70,000 a month nut, and so I've got to have volume to support that. And so you're going to do whatever you got to do until you can't.
And in terms of risk, it could mean like products that you maybe you're just more unsure or are less likely that they might actually make it. They actually might get to kind of at scale, based off of course, your experience. Um, is that kind of how we define risk?
Yeah, I think that's true, Mike. When you really want to when you're really seeking business because you feel your own situation is urgent, you have to make the assessment that in your better judgment, you may not be wanting to do this, but your circumstances require you to consider it. And that is a double-edged sword because there's a lot of energy, attention, and time and money that goes into onboarding a new client. And if the probability of market success is questionable at the outset, you may end up investing that time for naught. And that can only further complicate your own situation. So it's a constant evaluation. Um, what's most important to me is that their products are successful in the marketplace because that indicates to me there's demand. And then it's a matter of me being a supportive feature to supply. But in some cases, that question is not fully answered on the part of the brand. They may be selling in a high-end retailer like an Erewhon in Southern California. That doesn't mean they can sell in Safeway. That doesn't mean they can get into any scale sales level at the proposed pricing structure that they're currently operating at. So all of those things come into factor.
Do you ever have you ever gotten like pleasantly surprised? I mean, I know it's risk, but also at the same time, even though it's risk, it could also turn into successes. Have there ever been brands that you've worked with that, hey, we actually like maybe my better judgment, maybe I wouldn't have worked with this brand. I just kind of too risky product, and maybe I don't see I don't maybe see that there's maybe as much proof of demand as I would have liked to, but it ends up being pretty successful and a pretty great business, and it's kind of like a pleasant surprise to you. Does that happen?
Yes, it has. And it happened actually within the last 2 years. I was working with a bar company. It was literally a ground up startup, um, had nominal sales direct to consumer, had a very complicated mix sequence with a lot of ingredients. Um, it was a niche category of product. Never anticipated the success, the unbelievable success that ultimately came out of it. And we went through a lot of learning curves, ultimately a lot of process as well as formulaic changes. But at the outset, I would characterize the probability as low, and I was overwhelmingly surprised at the success. And it was so successful, actually, that it literally grew right through me and past me, and eventually went on to a much more um, established bar only manufacturer. So, yeah, it works on both sides of the equation.
Talk. I would love to hear more about a little about like those type of scenarios where you know you obviously want the brand to be successful. You're the one that has also taken the risk on the brand in some ways, right? I mean, obviously the brand's paying you to produce a product, but you're also taking some level of risk too, because of course you want, it's always. I'd imagine it's always better to have long-term customers as well than short-term customers, right? And so you're also and not only that, but the onboarding sequence that's I'd imagine quite intensive. Figuring out as well how to how to actually produce that product at a certain scale, and to be also like outgrown that. That's also not fun. So it's this like funny place that that you maybe have to sit where obviously you want every brand to be successful and you want to work with successful brands, but what actually happens when one of your brand kind of takes off, right? And does, really well. Um, and you can't, from your perspective, I'd imagine you can't go all in on that brand maybe because that maybe is too much risk as well. You also need to kind of spread your eggs across different brands. So how do you think about maybe these things when it comes to working with brands overall?
Yeah, as I reflected back, and I think there's occasions where, I might have, in 2020 hindsight, I would have approached it a little bit differently. But I think what's critical in all of it is that, you're both committed to making it successful. But that commitment, that express commitment, is not enough. And what really needs to happen is there needs to be a communication process in place that's open and transparent so that you're actually acting hand in glove through whatever growth or non-growth period is occurring, so that you're operating as real time together as you can. And in the cases where brands can outgrow you, um, the reality is that any given co-man's not going to be able to serve every situation optimally. Particularly a co-man that's doing multiple different product types like I was, with 6 or 7 clients at one time. It's difficult to be great at everything, and hence, um, you would like to get that down to maybe 2 or 3 of good solid running providers. But you only can understand how you're going to get to that point through maintaining a very open and transparent communication with the brand, and sharing your needs, in the future. What are we looking at? What do you think is going to happen? How do I support you? What are your concerns? I think, there needs to be really almost a mechanized tool of interaction between the brand and the manufacturer to keep these uh, communications open so that one understands where each other is going and where they are, so that you don't get surprised with, um, oh, by the way, I'm going to be leaving you because I'm going to a bigger manufacturer, or, oh, by the way, the business really isn't going very well, I'm going away. In both cases, you're losing a client. So it really is about working together. And, some of that you can establish in terms of contractual relationship. But more importantly, you've got to have trust, and you've got to build a solid professional relationship with the goals of each entity being shared commonly throughout the period.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and imagine it is kind of tricky to sometimes navigate from the side, but certainly it comes back to trust, right? I mean, they've obviously trusted you with their product, and as well as I'd imagine probably maybe there was some tweaking as well with their product. With probably every customer, whether it's complex or simplicity, there's just I'm sure always some type of tweaking that needs to happen in order to commercialize their product, especially get it to at a scale that actually makes sense, that is repeatable, that isn't kind of too complex. How also do you think about? Because I talked to one of the conversations I had on the show was about kind of like um, turnkey, working with the manufacturer in kind of a turnkey way where the manufacturer would it would kind of be on the manufacturer's balance sheet, essentially, and then of course the manufacturer is then charging a higher percentage in order for the total cost of inventory, but at the same time, for the brand perspective, it's easier. I use quotes because none of this stuff is easy. Making physical products is easy, but it's hey, like, okay, here are your products, you delivered your products, and like you're kind of paying for like the lump sum. Whereas whereas a brand vice versa, the brand's the one that's actually, sourcing all the ingredients, or kind of like doing, and are the ones that are actually placing the order, and also figuring out also maybe where to warehouse those ingredients or what have you. And there's, I would say, more involved when it comes to like the inventory and the cycle side and the cycles for each ingredient per se, and different parts of the supply chain. From a co-man's perspective, what do you actually prefer in this scenario? And I know that there's nuances there in terms of what's kind of owned by the co-manufacturer versus owned by the brand. But what are, in terms of responsibilities, what do you kind of prefer to actually engage with when it comes to a brand?
So traditionally in early stage brands, my clear preference is not turnkey. Um, you know, I would have had limited observation and experience with the brand. I don't know what legs it has. I don't know what the resource profile is behind it. I certainly wouldn't want to put myself at working capital risk for the ingredients and packaging materials for a brand that has yet to really been proven in the marketplace. So generally, early stage brands, there that's a big caution that tells me you take care of the materials, let me convert it, let's see how it goes. I'm willing to convert to turnkey, but we've got to get into an ordering pattern here and a reliability of production that says this makes sense for me. So the first phase is generally conversion only or tolling. In the case of making that decision to go to turnkey, it's really it's about volume, but it's also about the regularity of production. I can have a huge run of 3 days, but if I don't see the client for 3 months, that's not the kind of tempo that is effective for me. Because by the time that 90 days is elapsed and I'm running again, most people have forgotten how to do it. So I have to really kind of re-gear the organization and the company, the crewing, the training, excuse me, all the documentation to kind of bring them back, back in line with, SOPs for us. So the frequency of running, I don't like to see anything less than at least 2 to 3 days a month with a brand. And that's kind of bare minimum. We really would like to, see an upwards of a full week plus of a given brand, even though you can run various SKUs. But anything less than 2 to 3 days a month is problematic because the frequency is just difficult to manage. So again, early stage, not for full turnkey. The determination on turnkey is going to be on frequency, it's going to be on order size, and it's also going to be on the uh, establishment and history of the company itself. Maybe it's a private label for a retailer and they're coming out with a new line of ABC product. They're going to have the muscle, they're going to have the brand support. And so, again, you kind of make that assessment, and at the same time, you're trying to serve them in a way to give them a solution that's without complexity because they don't want complexity, but you also know that they've got a lot of resources behind the success of the product. So you're always weighing those evaluations and saying, what's risk? What's the reward? And most importantly, what's the continuity of the production need that I can plan and operate and execute against?
That makes, yeah, because you obviously, I guess you just, it's just not predictable at the very beginning when it comes to what it's actually going to be when it comes to from a frequency perspective. So you don't want to have that burden of having this on your balance sheet when it comes to actually the entire process. And then as it grows and there's more predictability, there's actually maybe inventory planning, right? That is like, okay, I can actually take on that risk because we've actually proved out some demand for your product.
Yeah, and keep in mind as well that you may come out with a given formula in 3 to 4 months, that formula may change. And those ingredients that were in there, and maybe they're replaced, maybe they're eliminated, maybe the packaging's got to change. So now, if I were to take on turnkey risk, Now I've got to undo that cost because it's dead. It's not going to go into production. And now you're going back saying, well, we got to write this off, but you got to pay me because I bought it. It gets into those kinds of transactions, which is, that's not where we want to spend our energy. Um, but guess what? If Trader Joe's comes to me and says, we want to do a coconut cookie and we're going to roll it out next week or next, whatever the time period is, I'm going to have a little bit different approach to that turnkey situation because they're going to go after that. They've committed to 455 stores. It's rolling on June 16th, and the first order is, 2 cases per store, and we're off to the races. Now, whether the product makes it or not, that's a different issue, but at least at the outset, you know what's behind it.
What are some of the most challenging, I guess, products you've had to produce, or even like ingredients you have to source?
Well, let me give you a situation. This is an early stage company, name not to be shared, but early stage company that was in the bacon analog business. And this is probably 3 years ago. Decent tasting product, but the nature of the manufacturing and what was required to do it, I always remember we had this long kind of lead time where we were working with an engineer and this pumping of the white and the red to simulate the fat in the meat. And we had these special trays anodized to look and shape like a bacon strip. And I remember we were in production perhaps the first couple of weeks, and I looked on the crewing floor and I saw, I want to say 24 people. And I said to myself, 24 people, California wages, do the math, and we're charging how much for a pound of bacon? And I knew that, that equation was out of balance. And there had to be a different way of doing that. But here again, this is where formulation and early stage process kind of design can set the stage for whether the product is actually going to be viable over time. And it was the technology, the pumping and dispension technology was not unique, but the timing and just how it reacted in an oven and ultimately was manually handled into packaging was just was kind of thick with touch, as I would say, and hence the cost was prohibitive. Um, and unfortunately, in the end, downstream from that, um, they went through a series of iterations. Ultimately, I don't think sustained themselves in the marketplace, but um, it can be a very difficult business if you're coming in rather heavy on complexity and requiring a lot of manual input to make the product, for sure.
If you were a brand, what would you value more? $100 of inventory or $100 cash?
I personally always bias toward the cash because you have utility to exercise it anywhere you want. But if you're a brand and you know you're selling and you've got inventory in hand, that is powerful because the process from cash to inventory is pretty laborious and can take time and a lot of effort to get there. So there's kind of stored energy in the $100 in inventory as opposed to perhaps the cash, which is more vapor energy.
Joe, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure having Joseph on the podcast. Joseph, thanks so much again for coming on the show. If you're enjoying Recogs, I highly recommend subscribing on whichever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That would really mean a lot, and liking this video. I also recommend, if you want to get involved in our community, go to manufacturer.com/events. We're now producing a number of events, coffees, happy hours, dinners. We're at several conferences throughout the year. Sign up. We'll let you know when we're in your town, so you can come out and hopefully meet other folks that are pretty cool as well, other brand owners or other investors or other retailers and distributors. It's always a lot of fun, and we hope it's helpful. Thanks for listening.